These two roundtables are part of the 2015 Institute of French Cultural Studies, which is the 12th institute biannually aimed at revitalizing and enriching the teaching of French. This year's subject, which was chosen almost 2 years ago, Culture and the Political, seemed to lend itself very well to the unfortunate events of this past January in France, and that is the reason I decided to add two special public events around this topic. And in fact, it is the focal theme of this institute. French culture has long been influenced just not by politics, what the French call la politique, but also about debates about what and who constitutes the political, what the French refer to as le politique. This subtle distinction in the French language between two words different only in gender has had profound consequences on the practice of everyday life by revealing how cultural practices of all types, religion, commerce, leisure, the arts, are also political. French thinkers throughout the centuries have asked what the extent of the political is or what it should be. Is it limited to the state, l'État, the nation, or should it be integrated in light of the idea of Europe from Charlemagne to the European Union? And just who constitutes its subject? What happens to the idea of the political in the face of immigration or international interventions, whether by Doctors Without Borders or the French Foreign Legion? What are the ethical parameters concerning the relationship between France and its former colonies? These issues have already been examined both historically, Middle Ages to the present, and globally, the Francophone world, by focusing on topics relating to literature, history, philosophy, political science, the visual arts, and anthropology. And some of the following themes will be explored. And let me name just a few: the political theater of Beaumarchais, satirical political writings from the Middle Ages to the present, the politics of Baudelaire, ethics, literature, and politics, theories of the political in various contemporary French philosophers, theories of what is known today as the new anti-Semitism, Stalinism, and representations of the political in film. Here's how we're going to proceed. I want to introduce very briefly each of our panelists, and each panelist has been limited to 6 to 7 minutes to present a position on the January events and its subsequent developments. And then there will be a general discussion followed by questions from the audience. Our first panelist, Pascal Bruckner, is one of the leading intellectuals in France today. He is a fiction writer, he's a philosopher, he's a public intellectual who brings passion to everything that he discusses. Much of his work has been devoted to critiques of French society and culture. And what I admire the most about him is that he's unpredictable in a very good sense. He doesn't follow party line. He's really a very independent intellectual. He published Pariahs, Lune de Fiel, which has been adapted as a film by Roman Polanski, Les Voleurs de Beauté, The Beauty Stealers, which won the prestigious Prix Renaudot in 1997. And amongst his many essays, I'm just going to name a few that I like a great deal. One from 2006 called The Tyranny of Penitence, and an essay which is really quite wonderful on the West Endless Self-Criticism, which has been translated, I think, by Princeton University Press, The Tyranny of Guilt, from 2010. Our next panelist is Carolyn Dean. Carolyn Dean is professor of French and Modern European History at Yale University. This is her second visit to the Institute. One was back in 1999. I think that was the year when we did Science and Culture. She's one of the best, very best interpreters of contemporary French history. She is the author of 5 books, most recently, Aversion and Erasure, The Fate of the Victim After the Holocaust, and The Fragility of Empathy After the Holocaust in 2004. Both were published by Cornell University Press. She is really a Renaissance woman. She has also done very important work on questions of gender and sexuality, focusing on France in particular. She previously held the John Haidt Professor of International Studies at Brown University. Our third panelist, who is making, thankfully, is this your second or third visit here?
Third, I think.
Your third visit here. Adam Gopnik, who is a Renaissance man as well, who many of you know from his wonderful essays in the New Yorker. He has written fiction, humor, book reviews, profiles, and among his writing is a book, a wonderful book about France that I'm sure some of you have read, in 2000, Paris to the Moon. Children's literature as well, one dealing with the comedy of parenting, Through the Children's Gate in 2006, and a children's novel, The King in the Window. He's written on food quite brilliantly, and I think it was around 2009, 2010, a book on Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin. We also know him as a frequent guest on Charlie Rose, and what I admire so much in Adam's work is his deep sensitivity to the human condition. And I might add, his ability to stand up to the Pen Club just last month. Our fourth panelist is Nicolas Weil, who is a man also who wears many hats. He is a philosopher, historian, and a first-class journalist. He has been with the leading French newspaper, Le Monde, since 1995, and he has written approximately close to 1,000 articles. He has edited since 2006 one of my favorite sections of Le Monde, Débat, and he also, from 1995, he oversaw the reviewing of French books in human sciences, history, and philosophy. He too is the author of many, many books. Let me just name some of them. A book published in 1998 with Laure Morat, for those participants who are here from UCLA. You should be pleased. The Expedition in Egypt, published at Gallimard in 1998. The Personal History of Anti-Semitism, published in 2002 at Robert Laffont. In 2004, La République et les Antisémites. And in 2014, Histoire, Histoire et Lumière, Changer le Monde par la Raison, a series of conversations with the noted historian Zev Sternhell, published by Albin Michel. He is currently preparing for Gallimard a political history of Jews in the 20th century, which should be out soon. So, as you can see, we have a really remarkable panel. Now, before we begin, I'd like to make a couple of remarks to bring to light, although I think the events of January have been permanently inscribed in my soul. On January 7th, 2015, two brothers, Saeed and Sharif, forced their way into the offices of the satirical magazine with Charlie Hebdo, and they brought with them assault rifles. They were part of the Islamic terrorist group, Al-Qaeda's branch in Yemen, and they killed one police officer and 11 cartoonists at that journal. Following that, there were 5 more who were killed and 11 wounded. On Friday, following that attack, there was another attack at a kosher supermarket in the area known as Vincennes, and sometimes there were those on either side of the Atlantic who've forgotten the connection between what happened in the supermarket and the Charlie Hebdo scene. But I'd like to tell you about a short anecdote. In last month, it was still May, I lost sight of time, I had the great pleasure of having breakfast with the chief rabbi of France. And during that breakfast, we discussed a number of issues. And one of them was the fact that there had been a Muslim man who protected Jews hiding downstairs in that supermarket. And he said, "That's my France. That's my France, where we work together and help one another as members of a community." Now, there were a lot of responses to this, and of course, one of the most important ones was the 2 million people protest that happened on the following Sunday, with 40 leaders from countries around the world, and people chanting, "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie. I think this is something that needs to be looked at as well. You know, what does that mean, I am Charlie? I think one's wrong, that's my personal take on it, to look at this as some kind of totalizing perspective. And I'm sure the panel will have a lot to say about the Olivier Todd book.
Emmanuel
Todd.
Olivier is his father.
Emmanuel Todd, thank you, book, and the charges against that. But I think one of the questions that needs to be asked about this is that, was this a call for national unity? Was it a call for something else? Personally, the demographics of the protest showed that it was a very diverse group of people. And I think one has to look at the many components that I think that Nicolas Wey and possibly Pascal Bruckner will talk about. Another thing that I'm sure will come up is the role of a satiric journal or satiric literature in the French tradition, which is a phenomenon that goes back to the Middle Ages. but also to remember, again, the specificity of what's happened in France. And I think when one looks at this from the United States, it's very easy to fall into the misreading of some aspects of this as just simple racism and lack of respect. I think one needs to take into consideration the movement away from the blasphemy law, which goes back to the French Revolution in 1830, but also the very specific separation of church and state in France, which goes back to 1905. It took the French a long time, but this was done to limit the power of the Catholic Church and catechism taught in state schools. So what's the role of satire? How does satire intersect with freedom of the speech? What is the specificity of freedom of the speech in a French context versus what do we think freedom of speech is? There are variants. I will now ask, and I will join the rest of you. Pascal Bruckner. Yes, maybe.
Okay, thank you, Larry, for inviting us to this gathering, which I believe took 2 years to prepare. 6 months after the attacks, there are many ways to interpret what happened in January around Charlie Hebdo and the hyper-cachère Porte de Vincennes, whose goal, I remind you, was to kill as many cartoonists and Jews as possible. We can say, like many said in France, that the Charlie Hebdo's cartoons have hurt the Muslims' feelings and that those cartoons were a racist initiative. We also can say that Islam, as a religion of the oppressed, deserve a special treatment and a special consideration, and that every attack, crime committed by jihadists can be explained by the situation of humiliation caused by Western colonialism and imperialism, and that the hatred of the Jews has its root in the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And if we want to focus on the freedom of speech, as Larry said, we could say that freedom of speech wouldn't be such an important issue were it not for it being first and foremost an injury. The allergy caused by the myriad of behaviors and beliefs among our fellow human beings. That other men dare contradict us, scoff at our beliefs or worship different gods is a priori unbearable. The famous quote Voltaire had been unduly credited with, I quote, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," is as vague as it is lofty. Our first reaction always amounts to sticking doggedly to one's position and to considering the faith and habits of others as mistaken or worse, outrageous. One needs to have been thoroughly acquainted with pluralism to overcome such a pain and to accept the diversity of beliefs and opinions as the norm of an open society. Democracy is unique in that it neither kills nor imprisons its enemies. It accepts conflicting interests, the alternation of powers, and the legitimacy of disagreement. We all agree to disagree, as you say in English, and to resolve our disputes in a civilized manner. It is not difficult to understand the frustration of a pious Muslim, Jew, or Christian in an environment that is not so. Their outrage at billboards that offend their sense of decency, at customs that antagonize them, at a freedom in tone, style, and looks quite foreign to their dogmas. For those who think they are the only guardians of the truth, these behaviors are an insult to God or to the past. One may judge the Western way of life to be contrary to decency. One may criticize it, make fun of it, avoid it as a sin. That is indeed the meaning of the phrase Boko Haram being, I remind you, an Islamist guerrilla in the center of Africa which has caused thousands of deaths. Yet, as imperfectly as it presently stands, Western way of life seems preferable to what was once the case. We will not confine women to their home, cover their heads, lengthen their skirts, jail gay people, forbid alcohol, restrict freedom of speech, ban religious caricatures, censor movies in order to avoid hurting the sensitive temper of a few bigots. We will not go back down the road of history in order to please obscurantists and their progressive allies of the left. And if indeed a show, a movie, or a cartoon offends the sensitivity of a group or a minority, one can always resort to public protestations or even a trial. It is always better to file a complaint or to call for damages rather than stabbing or gunning down the apostate or the unbeliever. We, Europeans and you Americans, are of course godless and decadent, pathetic in our aspirations and miserable in our pleasures, torn between our desires for emancipation and our nostalgia for the past. But at least have we built a civilization like no other in history, envied by many, based on prosperity and peace, combining both the respect of individuals and the diversity of their aspiration. And that is why the hatred of the West is always a hatred of law and liberty, something all the despots of this world know quite well, from Vladimir Putin to Ali Khamenei, without forgetting the self-proclaimed Caliph al-Baghdadi. To welcome the West is like slightly opening the door beyond which lurk boldness and chaos, the opposition to abuses dressed as eternal laws, to inequalities allegedly based in nature. It confronts each society with insuperable challenges to break free from tradition, to emerge from the comforting cocoon of custom, so as to invent new ways of being. One hates the West not because of its crimes or of its real shortcomings, but for its attempt to correct them, since it has been one among the first to free itself from its own barbarism, to liberate itself from monarchic and religious absolutism, calling on the rest of the world to follow it. In that respect, the true driving force of fundamentalism is not so much the overzealous respect of the scriptures, for the majority of jihadists are indeed Quranically illiterate, than the terror caused by a way of living based on individual autonomy, constant innovation, the questioning of authority, and the right to challenge established truth. The progress of freedom in the West and elsewhere in the world goes together with the progress of the hatred for freedom, and primarily for the emancipation of women, a crucial symbolic mutation. Islam has its rightful place in Europe. In that respect, it has a right to the freedom of religion, decent places of worship, and respect, as long as it abides by republican and secular rules, does not demand an extraterritorial status, special dispositions for women in swimming pools and gyms, for instance, a secluded teaching system, a spiritual cessation, or other various favors and privileges. The best one can hope for Islam, and in the interest of all, is neither Islamophobia nor Islamophilia, but a benevolent indifference in a spiritual market open to every religion. What one should be looking for is not the Islamization of Europe, but the Europeanization of Islam, the attempt to transform it into a religion like any other, endowed with the same rights and obligations, and which could afterward potentially influence positively the rest of the Muslim world. To carry out such a long-term endeavor, one must first begin by not surrendering, by not renouncing the heart of our legacy, the spirit of free inquiry, gender equality, religious privacy, the respect of individual rights and liberty. The Western way of life is simply not negotiable. Thank you.
Just before we move on to Carolyn Dean, I would like specifically to thank Stephen Roth of Vornado Realty for helping make these two events possible, and Rabbi Edward Boraz, who has been a great help through the Upper Valley Jewish community and the Dartmouth Hillel. So thank you.
Okay, rather than take a position, I thought I would sum up as reductively as I have to in the short time I have the positions that have been taken, because there have been some positions taken, and then try to use some, to raise some other issues that have received perhaps less discussion, certainly in the United States, and to make that perhaps a point of departure for some discussion. So the murders in Paris of the staff of Charlie Hebdo, and Charlie Hebdo, Monsieur Hebdo, as it were, and the Jews in the shopping in the Hyper Caché, or the kosher shopping market, seems to have elicited four arguments about the nature of the deeds done. One is that Charlie Hebdo, this magazine, offended everyone equally, and France is the land of Voltaire. Obviously, it's very reductive. As we know, this is your position, and yet it's far more complex and nuanced, obviously. So I want to stress that I'm going to be reductive. Charlie Hebdo, secondly, is racist or was insensitive to the French Muslim population. Another, what I think Pascal Buchner identified with a certain progressive population who's perhaps less wedded to the idea of free speech, or sees free speech as an Anglo-Saxon riff on a French idea. Charlie Hebdo was insensitive but also courageous. It was run by a breed of 68ers, meaning the generation of 1968, who were equal opportunity critics in the land of free speech. The fourth is a little less well-known, but has been made a few times, that the attack really was less about France than about the symbolic extension of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the anti-neo-imperialist insurgency in Europe. And that's really how we should see it, which, in my view at least, detracts from the actual deeds themselves, which have to be addressed, as I think you have done. So I just want to raise very briefly a few other things that have happened, a few other ideas, some of which are anecdotal, some of which are real. So first, the reining in of civil liberties since the murders. Now, this obviously happens once something that dramatic and tragic occurs in a free society. It has certainly occurred after 9/11 in the United States, and it's not surprising that it's occurring now in Europe. Now, more surveillance is to be expected along the lines of the NSA, French style, but there was also an effort, I should note, to resurrect a law on indignity that was first used in 1944 to dispossess and stigmatize collaborators. And this law, now they want to use it now. It hasn't gone through, but it was proposed as a means of punishing terrorists, and it would essentially take away their French passport if they were binational. So that the targets are very clear. In other words, the law intended not only to dispossess and therefore stigmatize the terrorists with the notion that they cannot, it would deny them their citizenship in everything but passport, and if they have two passports, it would deny them their French passport. All right. So this is, I think, quite dramatic, and I think it says a lot, and that we should be thinking about it. The other thing that has gotten attention, but I think less thoughtful attention than we might want to give it, is the ambivalent position of Jews in all of this. A kind of anecdotally, when I was in France after this happened, someone said to me, you know, I'm not an anti-Semite, but one of the things that I cannot understand is why those people who were murdered had to be buried in Jerusalem. All right? So this is something that was very difficult for a secular French person to understand, who saw this and saw this as, if they're French, why are they being buried in Jerusalem? Somehow this was incompatible with Frenchness. And we must also, so therefore, stress the ambivalent position of French Jews, as I said, and also the way that they are being used by a certain kind of discourse. Marine Le Pen recently said, well, she said it a few years ago, that there are some neighborhoods in which it is hard to be a woman, Jewish, gay, or even French or white. Now, you can do with this what you might, but this is a woman who could be perhaps the president, or a very, very important contender for the presidency of France very soon. And clearly the attempt to co-opt Jews and gays in the name of Frenchness, leaving out, obviously, a very specific group that need not be named, is quite transparent. Nonetheless, it's effective and yet not effective because Jews understand that Marine Le Pen does not represent them. The other thing I wanted to mention is that all of these speak to the affirmation of the French polity, I think, more than ever in terms of national belonging, implicit, for example, in the effort to resurrect the law of indignité, or indignity. So there's very much something that I wanted to bring up here, which is to what extent we should be discussing the question of national belonging in France and the way it's resurrected in response to the Je suis Charlie. What does national belonging mean? I think Larry alluded to this a little bit. What does it mean to be a French person in a pluralist environment, truly pluralist environment? And I wanted to say the response to this question, that there hasn't been a clear response, and to all of these issues that I'm raising that are not part of or are on the borders of discussion thus far, though they have been important aspects of the discussion, though not stressed very often. Here is what Manuel Valls, the Prime Minister of France, said right after the murders, and I'll quote, he said, laïcité, laïcité, laïcité. And that's, as everyone knows, untranslatable, but so it's laïcité. I don't know how to do it. It just means, as a very specific, historically constituted version of French secularism. He said, I praise the spirit of the Enlightenment, liberty, equality, fraternity, and this mix of dignity, irreverence, and elegance that characterize France, the incarnation of the universal. He was moved at that moment. But I think it's very interesting that at this very moment, what he was moved to say was to reaffirm laïcité, to reaffirm the spirit of the Enlightenment, to reaffirm the very specific association of freedom and of Frenchness with universalism, and even to bring up what's been called the idea of France, that is irreverent, dignified, and elegant, which is very interesting, the figuration of France in this sense. So I want to just finish by saying that historians, of course, have spilled a great deal of ink, as have many others, debating about various crises of the Republic. For a long time now, this began with the question of the veil and the expulsion of Muslim girls from school for wearing the veil. Also then it was raised with the PAC, the attempt to give gays and lesbians partner status, and whether they belonged in the same way to the polity as, and now of course there's gay marriage, though if a right-wing government comes in, they're threatening to undo this. And of course there's still a lot of problems with what's called reproductive technologies, which have been not accepted. So all the crisis of the Republic comes from the question of who belongs, right? And this has been raised since the 1980s, especially through the challenge posed by the Muslim population, which is now 6 million, and was not posed, for instance, by the Jewish population, though has been posed in new terms by an increasingly religious Jewish population. So this, now, of course, there have been various crises of the Republic, of the French Republic, from 1871 through 1958. And again, there is this, what everyone who writes about this dubs a crisis of republicanism. And this is, again, basically, to sum it up, a question about how French republicanism fails to grapple with the reality of a multi-ethnic and religiously pluralist society, now symbolized by the ostensible threat of Islam. And again, I would like to end by simply saying, who is writing about a new model of French national belonging and what that would look like? What does Charlie Hebdo and the response to Charlie Hebdo tell us about that? And so in other words, I want to say that the question of national belonging seems to be assumed. We understand what it means to belong, even though that's what we've been debating, and that's what's been torn asunder, not only by the conflicts in France over increasing pluralism and multi-ethnic, and the reality of a multi-ethnic population, but it's been underlined by the murders, and it's been kind of almost veiled, it's a very bad pun, by the absolutely enormous and moving demonstrations on the streets of Paris in January, because it looked like, as Larry said earlier, there's a diverse crowd. Everyone is Charlie, more rarely identifying with a victim of there were signs like that at the Hyper Cacher of the supermarket. But nonetheless, this question has never, to my mind, at least in most of the voluminous, or rather in the many essays I've read, it isn't usually addressed as such. So I think it's interesting to sort of move perhaps beyond the free speech issue, or use the free speech issue as a springing board to ask about other questions. Thank you.
Adam Gopnik.
Thank you. And let me just say quickly first what a pleasure it is to be back at the Institute. I'm afraid I only was able to get away for a single afternoon, but that should be further proof that when Larry Kritzman speaks, Francophile Americans listen and obey his call and get here as quickly as they can. Let me also add that I feel strongly how inadequate I am to discuss these events in comparison with old friends like Nicolas Vey and Pascal Bruckner, or a scholar like Carolyn Dean. I've only been back to France once since the tragedy, and feel my inadequacy to comment on it, or at least being forced into the role of the expert who has a strong opinion on things that he has not seen. But I will nonetheless try and say something, because I have written several things about the events. I wrote a piece for The New Yorker immediately afterwards. I wrote something for the BBC not long after that, and have since then, in a series of pieces, tried to meditate, occasionally close up, once close up, but more often at a remove, about France, free speech, and the Charlie Hebdo murders. One of my favorite French idioms, which was often used in my years in France, is that it ought to always be possible to count to two, that we should always be able to count to two. I have heard that used, I think, often by Pascal, in fact, in reference to everything from child rearing to adultery. But I think it applies relevantly to the conversation that we're having this afternoon. It means, as I take it, that it's always possible to see that the invocation of one important and even vital principle does not forbid another complementary one from being invoked at the same time or in addition. And I feel that way very strongly about when we consider France in the post-Charlie Hebdo moment. It is certainly the case that one of the hardest things to do in a modern society is to distinguish the sensational from the significant, to distinguish things that are scarifying and unforgettable from things that are truly symptomatic of profound changes and profound difficulties, challenges, crises in our world. All of us who are Americans, particularly those of us who are New Yorkers, can recall how, in all honesty and in many ways, how warped our vision of the world became post 9/11, because we became convinced that this most sensational of terrorist attacks was equally significant, that it was a harbinger, it was a sign of a much larger global conflict which we had to confront, which we had to enter into for fear that it would consume us. I think that we could all agree that at least that this was an exaggerated or an hysterical view of the reality of what had happened then and of what happened since. And similarly, one of the things that strikes me when I think about the post-Charlie Hebdo moment is that we can fairly and accurately stress the singularity of the assault. This was not a lynch mob made up of tens of thousands of French Muslims storming the offices of Charlie Hebdo. This was instead two brothers deranged by hate, and then a third accomplice, also so deranged, who did these terrible acts. To what degree they are implanted within concentric circles of sympathy is a significant question and one we can pursue. But I think we always run a risk if we see the sensational as necessarily the significant. I think we can see, as Olivier Roy asks us to, that there is no monolithic Muslim community in France, but simply a population with all the usual variations of all such populations in the world. And I think seeing that, counting that one, is essential. In the BBC broadcast I did immediately after the attacks, I talked both about Volinsky, one of the murdered cartoonists who I had known, had had dinner with and admired, and I juxtaposed my knowledge of him with my knowledge of two very close Muslim friends in Paris who were in the midst of trying to raise a Muslim family within an entirely French context and with children who were being as thoroughly Frenchified, if you like, or were attempting the act of being made French and Muslim at the same time, as my own grandparents did with similar kinds of difficulties when they came from Russia as Jews to America in the 1920s. I think that that's an important thing to count to, and I think that's an important reality to keep in mind, that the sensational act is not necessarily more significant than all of the positive steps towards understanding and assimilation that go on at the same time. But it's also essential, and here's where I think we have to count it to, and no denial of that important truth, to see that while fanaticism is the enemy, not faith, and not any particular faith, faith is and always has been the prime seedbed of fanaticism in the world. We cannot simply wish away the reality that religious beliefs held passionately by any number of believers will always pose a threat, not merely a challenge, but a real threat to the life of an enlightened society. To wish that away or to argue it away, I think, is to miss a reality every bit as essential as the reality of the variation, size, and of the French Muslim population. And I think, and I agree so strongly here with my friend Pascal, that the reaffirmation of those Enlightenment values can never be taken to be a reactionary gesture, that it's always, in fact, a radical gesture towards reaffirming the possibility of pluralism, of coexistence, the possibility of an open society based on free argument rather than the reaffirmation of a rational dogma. This truth was true at the time of the Dreyfus Affair, with different actors and different religious minorities engaged, and it remains true now. I think, if I might add a particularly American perspective to it, one of the reasons those of us who are Americans, or Canadians in my case, and who are drawn to the study of France, either in a scholarly context or in a belletristic way, like mine, is exactly because in France we see historically, as we see it presently, that battle between open and closed societies, that struggle between the values of the Enlightenment, so many of them originating in and first articulated in France, and the possibilities of an organic, closed, assured, authoritarian society. We see them over and over again in such sharp contrast and with lines drawn almost architecturally with a clarity that we don't often have in America. One of my favorite talking pieces whenever I'm talking about French history is to remind American listeners that the Eiffel Tower, the Tour Eiffel, and Sacré-Cœur are contemporary monuments, that they are not, as one might think, one from the past and one representing the future, but that they represent an argument about the nature of modernity, which was intense and strong between the possibility of a scientific, rationalized modernity on the one hand, and a backward-looking, or if not necessarily backward-looking, one strongly longing for the values of a lost organic society on the other. We see again and again those quarrels, those confrontations in French history and in French life with a clarity that is both dramatic and also instructive for those of us who sit within a society where those conflicts, though very real and ongoing, have on the whole been more muted. Finally, let me say just a few words about the specific issue of free speech, which Larry referenced in his introductory remarks. It's true that though I have been at a remove from the specifics of the Charlie Hebdo massacre and its after effect in France, I was very much in the midst of a kind of smaller front that sprung up from it within the slightly Trollopian precincts of the chapter of American Pen in New York, focusing on the Penn banquet. As some of you may have known, there was a decision on the part of the Penn executive to give a Courage to Write award to the surviving staff of Charlie Hebdo, and in itself an astonishing statement to have to make. There was, in turn, a protest, very much along the lines of some of the positions that Carolyn was outlining against it, feeling that though we surely should not applaud the murder of cartoonists, nor did we have an obligation to give them an award for insulting vulnerable people. I spoke strongly and wrote strongly on the opposite side, that we had to honor the survivors of the Charlie Hebdo massacre and that we were obligated to. And the distinction I wanted to draw, a distinction that I think oddly enough is already implicit in a great deal of French law on the subject, a great deal of French thinking about the difference between hate speech and free speech, is exactly that we can make a clear, not absolute because no distinctions are absolute, but we can make a clear distinction between insults to an ideology and threats to a person or to people. That's not that hard a distinction to make. And that it's the core belief of an open society, of an enlightened society, that insults to your ideology take the place of, not only are acceptable, but that they take the place of threats made to people. And that we simply have to swallow hard and accept that insults to our ideology, including, I hardly need add, the ideology of liberal pluralism, are not just acceptable, but are vital. They are exactly the currency of what we mean by free debate in a free society. Threats to people, threats to persons, are a very different thing. When someone says, I do not like your views and therefore I will come and kill you, that is a very different thing from someone saying, I think your God is foolish, or I think that your beliefs are foolish. That's not a difference, it seems to me, of degree. That's a true difference in kind. It's a foundational difference in kind that we need to make over and over again. And whenever we ask, is this a threat to a person? Is this speech hate speech or is it free speech? We can simply ask, does it make a threat to a person, or does it simply insult someone else's ideology? It seems to me, obviously, that again and again, in a scabrous tradition that is, in many respects, particularly French, if not peculiarly French, the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo were always making insults to other people's ideologies and never making threats to the existence or well-being of other persons. I'm well aware that there's a way of interpreting an insult to your ideology exactly as if it were a threat to your person, but that's exactly where the line between open and enlightened societies and closed and tribal ones exists. Thank you very much.
Nicolas Vey.
Thank you, Larry. That's my fourth visit in Dartmouth. It's always very moving and quite an experiment. Since our roundtable is taking place within an institute devoted to French culture, I cannot help myself beginning my statement by quoting a famous episode of Flaubert's Sentimental Education. Frédéric Moreau, the main character of the novel, literally obsessed by his mistress, the beautiful Madame Arnoux, spends most of his time during the day of the 1848 revolution, wandering about like a lost soul in a Paris where the streets are bristling with barricades, thinking exclusively about the way he could join her at last. Strangely enough, my own experience of the big demonstration of January 11th was more or less the same, due mostly to the fact that I was reluctant to mingle with the demonstrator. The reason for it was, in the one hand, because as a journalist who was not in charge of covering the event on professional grounds these days, I was supposed to stay neutral. And on the other hand, because I am skeptical towards such show of unanimity. But by this time, it has been impossible to me to escape from the crowd, both dense and static, which was shuffling along the Place de la République in the center of Paris. And I had eventually the opportunity to see the components it was made of. Of course, I do not claim myself to be a social scientist, making his point with scientific rigor, as the demograph and historian Emmanuel Todd put in his essay, Qui est Charlie? Who is Charlie? Published in May, which has arousing fierce debates among French intellectuals and in the press. Let us briefly recall that according to Emmanuel Todd, the bulk of January's 11 demonstrators were nothing but successors of a so-called zombie Catholicism, white and Islamophobic, heirs of the anti-Dreyfusism or even of the Vichy regime. Let me express some objections. Most of the people who were roaming the pavement then were certainly not accustomed and usual demonstrators. I have myself noticed that a lot of them came with their family, strollers and so on, and were apparently rather bourgeois, sometimes bobo. There was a large proportion of young people. I would not dare to claim it was anyhow significant, but from the place where I was, I had the impression that there were a solid proportion of Jewish demonstrators. Considering the placards I saw, it cannot be said that the anti-Semitic dimension of the January attacks have been neither forgotten nor concealed. Among my choses vues, I remember a kind of banner waved by a group of Kurdish activists. In short, nothing like the Islamophobic search for any scapegoat exuding from the upper middle class described in the Todd's essay. Todd goes as far as speaking about the January 11th in terms of imposture. After the publication of Todd's books, the Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, himself bothered to write an answer in an op-ed published by Le Monde. He denounced in it the lack of responsibility of some French intellectual keen to succumb to the fashionable temptation of populism, unquote, bringing into opposition self-righteous people versus elite. But the politicians were not the only one making a case against Todd's book. Some sociologists, as labeled social scientist as Emmanuel Todd, have criticized him, focusing not only on his idea, but on his method as well. For example, in Le Monde, Nona Meyer, a political scientist of the CNRS, has given as counter-argument a commentary of survey carried out by the Commission Nationale Consultative des Droits de l'Homme and conducted in March in order to measure the impact of the January 7-9 attacks on French public opinion. According to this survey, the lower class was indeed less present at January 11 demonstrations, but also far from missing. Quote, the total cumulated of workers and employees is equivalent to the total of low and upper middle class, unquote, she claims. Nona Meyer claims that the second or third generation of immigrants as well were thoroughly present at the demonstration and that the probability of taking part in the mobilization was greater among the sample of Maghrebian and sub-Saharan origins than that of the French and European. Moreover, it is worth noticing that the more the people have claimed themselves sympathizing with the Front National, the more the far-right party of Marine Le Pen, the more they tend to distance themselves or even to reject the demonstration. So, where is the so-called imposture? Were the 4 million of demonstrators a war machine against Muslims, as Todd pretends? Is it really possible to see those demonstrations as a religious crisis to the less, as he did? Nevertheless, saying that far from renewed fraternity, whether the demonstration of January were the signal of a new polarization of French society is still open to debate. It is still doubtful anyway that the defense of free speech alone could have produced such a huge rally. The spectacular nature of the attack and the following manhunt in the northern suburbs played their part too. Let us recall incidentally that French public opinion and intellectual, in comparison to Germany, have shown very few concern about the defense of whistleblowers like Edward Snowden or the misuse of the NSA program. By the way, Todd's theses have been already formulated before by the Israeli historian of fascism, Zev Sternel. You mentioned the conversation I had with him. Quote, the old Europa, mostly white people and Christians, were marching in the cortege, including Jews. Everybody understands that the grandiose rally in Paris never would have taken place only if the Jews would have been involved, unquote. That was an op-ed by Zev Sternel published by Le Monde, right after January 11. Introducing his book, Emmanuel Todd has also pointed out the troubling underestimation of the anti-Semitic dimension of the event. Quote, the true question for France is less free speech and caricature than the growing anti-Semitism in suburban areas, he says. More generally speaking, it can be said that the nowadays proliferating sociology of demonstration is questionable. The essay by the sociologist and historian Pierre Birbaum, who were often here in Dartmouth, sur un nouveau moment antisémite jour de colère, published fittingly a few weeks after the attack, is another example of the both stimulating and disappointing nature of the genre itself. This brief book deals, in fact, with a rally of the year 2014 in February. Beerbohm focuses on a demonstration where an unexpected collision took place between far-right extremism and radical anti-Zionism, connecting themselves in anti-Jewish hatred. That kind of confluence is striking indeed. But it is really symptomatic of deep tendency of French society at large. In the past, the success of demonstration could have been misleading. Everyone can recall the million of Berliner protesting against the assassination of Walter Rathenau by a nationalist extremist in 1922. Could legitimately have led to conclusions that the democracy was deeply rooted in German society then. No need to tell what followed. The consequences of the so-called Arab Spring could leave us as pessimistic as ever in the same way. A demonstration could also be considered as a soap bubble. During a moment it gathers forces, possibly contradictory. But after dispersal, it is possible to think that the things are over and do not necessarily stay as it was during the émotion, the old French term for manifestation, demonstration. It is true all the more concerning the January 11th. It is surprising how fast the fallout has followed the acme in this case. For instance, recently the cover of the weekly German Die Zeit was "Nobody wants to be Charlie anymore." The attempt made by more than 200 American writers to boycott the attribution of the PEN Prize for Charlie Hebdo, you mentioned, without generating a wave of protestation in France is another sign of such a trend. So seeking for signification can have the opposite effect and lead to the stigmatization maybe of a whole group because some individuals are apparently going adrift. There is no reason why the killing spree and amok ride of the Kouachi brother and Hamedi Koulibaly should be considered as typical of their own milieu, merging the conversion of these terrorists to radical Islam and activism with the so-called problème des banlieues seem as confusing as a sermon made by French intellectual Michel Onfray and Pierre-André Taguieff, that a debate should be opened on the following issue: is the difference between a pacific Muslim and a terrorist a question of nature or degree? In the final analysis, sociological determinism, though useful, can also be offensive, especially when it applied to Charlie Hebdo sequences. Social destitution and post-colonial resentment should not systematically be underlined as a causa causans. Otherwise, there is a great risk of resurrecting the old notion of classe dangereuse, dangerous class, all the poor being allegedly a terrorist. As a matter of fact, radical Islam and terrorism, despite the horror it carries, are essentially politics. As a famous orientalist, French orientalist Gilles Kepel put it, the January attacks falls well within the framework of a strategy. The goal is, of course, the destabilization of the West. The outburst of violence, among others, aim to isolate Muslim minority in Europe in order to turn them into a pool of potential fighters. It can be said that focusing interpretation of the January attacks on politics or geopolitics could be the way clearing the road to an intellectual responsibility in a new world of violence. Despite the unforgivable atrocity of killing innocent people with bullets, bombs, or drones, the geopolitical dimensions seem to be no less the best way to understand what went on last January. Looking for the answer in a cartographie des passions et des divisions françaises is misleading. Essentialism is always a dangerous path. It is true, however, that the wild rise of some young French going to Syria, Iraq, and the Islamic State, and saying this, I have no intention of minimizing the phenomenon, shows in one respect how deep the feeling of revolt is in our society. Quoting here the word of Goethe, so often misunderstood, rather an unrighteousness than a disorder, is tantalizing, but that does not tell the whole story, far from it. As a provisory conclusion, let me finish by a personal remark. A few weeks ago, I have had the opportunity of meeting the Jewish British writer Howard Jacobson, well known for his ironic vein. In his last and striking novel, A Kind of Dystopia, G, it's the title, he described a world whose Jews have been completely eradicated. In this world, every disturbing modernism, he says, has disappeared as well. The art is gentle, easy, and naive. Such a world is dull because it has lost his most favorite object of detestation. During our meeting in Paris, he suddenly looked at me with his face like a jumping jack and said, you see, if anti-Semitism have resisted to something like Holocaust, it will never be uprooted. This could be, unfortunately, the kind of consensus the Charlie episode has left behind. Thank you.
I think one subject that would be interesting to talk about after all four of these presentations is the difference, if one can establish one, between free speech and hate speech. We've had these debates in the United States, and of course in France they take a different tone. Free speech, the debate of whether Charlie Hebdo was racist, and yet you have hate speech, where there are specific laws against hate speech. I'm thinking of the French rap singer Dieudonné, or the many outrageous comments made by Jean-Marie Le Pen concerning the Holocaust. And I also think in the US there are some misconceptions where we get lost in translation. And I'm wondering whether some members of the panel might address this issue of free speech and hate speech. Even here, I'm never quite sure of how to measure.
Well, may I add that there are also strong hate speech laws in the Free Society of Canada, a country we always miss, though half Francophone and half Anglophone, without major interference with the capacity to speak. I think that it's historically the case that most of the hate speech laws derive, almost in the most cases, directly from Holocaust denial, from negationism. That's usually the proximate cause of it, that somebody engages in, certainly the case in Canada, people engage in Holocaust denial, and the response of the rest of the society is to pass a law that says, you can't say this. You can say countless things, but this is one of the things that you can't say.
And of course, Faurisson got away with
it yes.
in France.
At the risk of repeating myself, and I'm sure everyone else in the panel has more illuminating things to say, but I will repeat, but I happen to have written about this for The New Yorker, so I will say again that it seems to me that Americans tend to get paralyzed or bewildered or indignant at that conception and say exactly, well, why is it all right for Charlie Hebdo to insult Muslims and it's not all right for Le Pen to deny the Holocaust, or Dieudonné to use the quenelle, the parodic version of the Nazi salute that he's popularized. So, well, why are those things? Why are some of these things forbidden and others these things accepted and encouraged? And again, I tried to draw the distinction, I'll say it again quickly, between insults to an ideology and threats made to people. The, replicating the Nazi salute, even in parodic form, is clearly a threat made at and to French Jews, and especially when it's made and sent on a selfie outside of Auschwitz. Its meaning is, I think, perfectly clear, and you have to be a bit of an idiot not to see it properly as a threat. An insult to Judaism in Voltaire's great tradition, the notion that one could mock or belittle the faith of the Old Testament, is a very different kind of enterprise. It might be an enterprise we found false, distasteful, disgusting, misleading, but it seems to me clearly a different kind of enterprise. That's a distinction, like every other distinction we make in the real world, that you cannot make with absolute clarity. You can make no distinctions of those kinds. The distinction between first-degree murder and manslaughter and self-defense are equally all pitched on a gradient. Nonetheless, it seems to me a significant distinction to make. And if I recall the Dieudonné case with any clarity, it was specifically that he openly identified and then deleted his open identification with the murderers of the Jews, the murderer of the Jews at the Hypocacher. That seems to me a very different statement than I am powerfully, passionately anti-Zionist. Those seem to me very different things.
Absolutely.
And that we are able to distinguish without obliterating the idea of free speech.
Yes, just to continue on Adam's words, I think the main issue now is this new concept of Islamophobia. And Islamophobia confuses two things which are very different in my opinion. The first, the right to criticize a religion, any kind of religion. And for instance, in France, you can mock Christianity, you can mock Judaism, you can mock Buddhism. I remember a cartoon representing Jesus on his cross and saying, quick, give me a nail, I'm falling down. Or Moses taking his bath and he lost his soap. So he opens the water of his bath as he opens the waters of the Red Sea to find back his soap. So those cartoons aroused no protest. And if you remember, for instance, this famous Monty Python's movie where Jesus is on the cross with these two thieves and they start singing, "Let's see as the bright side of life." So, we've been brought up with this tradition. And our religion are tolerant enough to accept a certain dose of critics and irony. And if you do the same for Islam, so you're a criminal, you're a racist, and you deserve the worst. So why is there a double standard? On one hand, you can laugh at Christianity or Judaism. On the other hand, Islam must and will remain untouchable. And of course, that is.
Can I just say, because we agree about most of this, but let me at least make the counter case, because it's the case I was arguing with the other side of the Penn debate as well. And that is, as you know very well, the argument goes, Islam is different because Islam is a religion of an oppressed minority. Islam is not a religion in power. Islam is a religion deprived of power. And that therefore, though we may claim merely to be mocking the Prophet or mocking Islam in exactly the same way that we mock Christianity and Judaism, we can mock Christianity and Judaism with license because they are not under any real threat. They are the religion of the powerful and those who are in possession of the society. Islam, by virtue of being the religion of an oppressed minority, is not unlike the way that 100 years ago in France, to mock Judaism at the time of the Dreyfus case had a very different meaning, a very different charge than it does today.
Oh yes, of course this analogy is quite confusing. And I think it's a huge lie. And very strangely, the word Islamophobia now has a word spreading. It's all over in every writing. But there is another word which does not take, it's Christianophobia. And if you look at the what's happening nowadays in the Middle East, in every country, Muslim country of the Middle East, Christians are being persecuted. They're being forced out by jihadists or radical Muslims. And yet this word Christianophobia doesn't work. So what is happening? It's happening that all the stress is put on Islam only, because radical Muslims are asking for themselves a special position. And they think of themselves, unfortunately, not as being one of the three religions of the book, but as being the final and unique one. So Islam sees itself not as a religion among many others, but as a successor that invalidates Christianity and Judaism. And that's precisely the issue.
Right. But what do you make of the argument that by virtue of being the religion of an oppressed and impoverished minority, Islam demands, in the French context and the American one as well, special sensitivity?
I think that's unbearable. That's totally anti-democratic. And many Muslims refuse this kind of claim, especially women, whether in Canada, in the United States, in Germany, in France. You have a lot of secular, moderate Muslims who beg us on their knees not to give in to the demands of the radicals. Because Muslim women in France, they want to walk along without a veil. They want to behave like ordinary citizens, and they want to be let free to believe or not to believe in God. As when you're a Christian, you can go to the Mass on Sunday, or skip a Sunday, or skip 2 Sundays, or be only a Christmas Christian. And many Muslims in France also would like to have the right not to do the Ramadan. But of course, if they don't do it, they will be denounced, or they will be, they might be persecuted.
Shunned by the...
Yeah, shunned by, exactly. So I think this kind of demand is extremely racist, in fact, because it's, it's part of the culture of the excuse, and we believe that the Muslims are so backwards that they cannot enjoy the same rights as we do as a Christian, Jews, or atheists. And this kind of requirement, in my view, is a neo-colonialist policy, which should be condemned.
Elie van Avis.
I go for one moment with Adam Sandler, which is not Adam Sandler, of course. It's one of the arguments that you can give let's say it's a valid argument. Yes, Islam is the religion of the downfall, but they deserve more, how should I say, massacre, or the kindness.
Sensitivity is the usual word in the United States.
So what? What's the consequence of this argument if I accept it? Shall I forbid the Charlie Hebdo, shall I kill this journalist? So even if I accept it, let's say I hate the content of Charlie Hebdo, it will be vulgar, they attack the religion of the downtrodden, it's not done.
But let me repeat it, because I think some people had difficulty hearing it too, and then respond. Let me say, first of all, I find myself taken aback by becoming the spokesman for a position that I don't embrace, but nonetheless is clearly the counter-argument that needs to be raised. The point was, so what? Even if you accepted the stipulation that Islam is in some sense in a different case, in a special case, even if, in fact, it is a religion of the persecuted and the oppressed, and that it needs to be seen in a specific historical light in Europe, given all of that history. So what? Does that give you license to go murder cartoonists because they mock you? Does that give you license to behave in a way that all the other citizens of a republic or a democratic society don't enjoy? Even if that were true, what's the cash value of it, as we would say in
If I may just one sentence, I think we should disconnect between the content of Charlie Hebdo, which in my opinion is totally material, and the right of these people to say what to write whatever they want.
Right.
Totally disconnected. You like it or you don't like it, this is material. Accept it in our society. This is lawful. It's
right. Did everyone hear? Just repeating that we need to disconnect the particular artistic activity or satiric activity of Charlie Hebdo from the other questions of how you feel about Islam, the impression of Malgrabian minorities, and so on, that these are two distinct questions that need to be dealt with distinctly.
Yes, I think it's important issue, but it's a part of a question of the free speech that the people who feel outraged by Charlie Hebdo cartoon should have the right to express, but in the weeks following the January 11, it was almost impossible. Every imam, every people from Muslim origin should say that he condemned the killings, of course, and distinct himself from the killings. So the problem is when this question of and he had no more right to express his this content concerning the caricatures of.
We can, Carolyn,
Go ahead.
no, go
No, I
ahead.
was just going to say something really that I think is simple, that I think you were saying implicitly before, which is, of course, but at the same time, what the murders raised in relationship to freedom of the press is really, freedom of the press almost seems to me, while it's a very important idea and it has to be stressed and defended, or free speech, nonetheless, what it really raised was the question of what multi-ethnicity means in France. And what it really raises is the question of structural inequity between Muslims and others. I don't think, I mean, so to separate those two is very important, but then once you separate them, then what do you do? I mean, that's the question. What do you do with the structural inequity and how do you resolve it? And the problem, at least as I understand it, it has not been resolved. It is either responded to with this kind of, well, Christians, Jews, and Muslims are all the same in the end, or it doesn't, the structural inequity doesn't matter, right? So that's one position, and one has to agree that it's not the structural inequity can never excuse murder, but hate speech is about structural inequity, which is why it gets blurred, right? When you start talking about hate speech, it actually says very clearly people have been treated in a certain way historically or in the present, and we cannot defend that speech because it hurts in a special way, but it hurts people who are structurally inequitable, right? Because who are vulnerable, as I think it was Gary Trudeau said, that it's mean or something, right? So you're being mean to people, right?
Punching down was Gary's phrase.
Was that his word? And so I think that it's very important for us here to think about these things separately. And I think it's hard because, as you were saying, Americans have trouble with free speech, right? So I think you were saying hate speech and free speech need to be seen as separate things and they can coexist. But in France, they got this whole incident brought out both issues, right? And then they all get subsumed under the question of free speech when it really is about structural inequity, and they need to be separated in order for any clarity, I think, to.
Well, then there's another issue that comes in, and that's this whole satirical tradition in French culture. Does one completely reject it because of a kind of exceptionalism?
Well, oddly enough, this is an embarrassing admission to make for someone who never got his PhD finished, but I wrote my PhD thesis on French caricature journals at the end of the 19th century. And it is one of the striking things, because that was a seedbed of modernism, very important and easily overlooked one. And I think that there is a particularity there that runs directly from Philippon and Daumier to Charlie Hebdo that doesn't have a neat American equivalent. The American equivalent of that is Mad Magazine or something like it, which is directed at 12-year-olds rather than at 40-year-olds. And it is exactly. So that is a rich tradition, and I think that this is a kind of a cultural analysis that you may share or not, that you sort of need to know in order to fully understand it. So that the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo, one of the things that struck me and moved me about them is that they were both insiders and outsiders. Wolinski had a Légion d'honneur. He was hardly an outsider, nor was he treated as one by the people who knew him. He was hardly an anarchist on the margins, nor were the rest. Chabot was a Saturday morning I remember seeing on Saturday morning television when I was a young boy. So they were totally accepted within the French establishment and still had the license to be outrageous and scabrous and so on. That's not, with some rare exceptions, that's not a role that you typically see in America, that you can be both. I guess we give that license to stand-up comedians, don't we? We give it to Chris Rock, or Chris Rock can say wildly outrageous things and still have a children's program.
Sarah Silverman.
Or Sarah Silverman, yes, I withdraw that remark. But we put it somewhere else. We put it with Chris Rock or Sarah Silverman or George Carlin, and we would be not just as shocked by the cruelty, but as stunned by the miscomprehension if a member of the Jewish Defense League or something went after Sarah Silverman for being anti-Semitic. We'd say, no, it's not just a crime, it's a category mistake that you're making at that moment. And I think that is part of the background of this specificity.
Yes, just 2 points.
We'll have questions.
Yes, and then just to answer to Catherine, I think we try, and the extreme left tries to connect jihadism with social problems. You know, the religion of the oppressed has only one way to defend itself. It is by throwing bombs and cutting the throats of the infidels. And I think this is not true. Remember that bin Laden was belonging to the richest family of Saudi Arabia. Most jihadists have diplomas, they are scientists. The Kouachi brothers were not poor people. They had a job, they had a good formation. So the connection which is made in a quite simplistic Marxist way between poverty and religious fanaticism doesn't work in the case of Islam. And the main financiers of jihad is Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which are extremely rich countries. So this connection cannot be made. And I think it's a trick, it's a lie which we like to tell ourselves. The other thing about the satirical tradition of Charlie Hebdo, as you know, maybe Charlie Hebdo was going bankrupt just before the attacks. And it was the spirit of the 68ers, as you said, and it was a little dull at the end. And so this attack, of course, revived the finances of the newspaper. But on one way, the fanatics have won, because Luz, the boss of Charlie Hebdo, said they had finished with Mahomet. So there will be no more cartoons of Mahomet in Charlie Hebdo. So the fanatics have won. And that's the sad lesson of what happened. The force is always stronger than the satire.
One thing before we move on to questions from the audience, French exceptionalism, because this is a symptom of what you could call the crisis of the French idea of the universal, and one may be for the secular in society, but it appears to be facing a crisis. And what's called laïcité, which can be used for different ends, is facing a number of real problems now. Where to go from that? And what about the whole idea of exclusion, the feeling of belonging? How is this imaginary community called France constituted?
Yeah. Hearing Adam Gopnik's presentation, I was struck by this very stimulating visual confrontation between Le Sacré-Cœur and La Tour Eiffel, and about free speech and all these issues. One must take into account the context of modern history in France, and not maybe dealing with that in two general terms. In the contrary of other countries like Germany, for instance, there was a continued tension between Catholic and the Republican state are we supposed to go so far as Todd when he claimed that the split between Catholicism and the Republicans has been remaining until today and is overlapping territorial division within France itself? I don't know. Maybe it's intellectually seducing, but not thoroughly convincing. It seems to me that any discussion concerning these issues, like blasphemy, the right to blaspheme, should include that particular configuration in France that was stressed, among others, by Pierre Birnbaum. It is not just a question of law and principles, I think.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments, Caroline?
I was going to say it's just something about humor when you were talking about satire, because one of the things that strikes me is American humor tends to come from disempowered people. So it's Jewish humor, African American humor. They tend to be defensive postures of various kinds. That's what the humor is, right? It's self-deprecating, or it's insults being traded, right? And French humor is very different. So I do think that the mainstreaming, or I mean Sarah Silverman and you know Tina Fey or someone, and they tend to be women who are non-conventional, right? Those are American comics, right? Not, I mean Jon Stewart is Jewish. I mean I don't think it's a coincidence
But
that
they're not. But most of those people are not disempowered.
No, I'm not saying, but they represent a certain humor whose lineage is disempowerment. I mean, it comes from a certain kind of
right. Historically, that's true, but historically, it strikes me that's true about the French tradition as well. Though the disempowerment tends to be more class and
yes.
faith-based than it is ethnic-based. Certainly, Daumier saw himself as speaking for the disempowered and satirizing the powerful on their behalf.
And that's yes. And what I was going to say is one of the things that seems to have happened with the République is that the left and the right no longer they can't even argue the same way, right? Because the language of laïcité and the crisis is around questions of culture and the way that we're supposed to have culture wars, and they're somehow pitted against economic. The economic dimension of life, as if they are separable. Anyway, that's something else. But it seems to me that the concept of class, though it lives on, it has sort of faded away in favor of the concept of multi-ethnicity, and all these wars, as it were, are fought, the guerres franco-françaises, are fought around the concepts of multi-ethnicity and what is the République now. And laïcité is an example of something that is not clear what it means to people anymore, or people think they know what it means, but it's actually in dispute. And that's all I wanted to say about that.
Can I just ask a question that, and it's genuinely, well, it comes with a preface, but it's genuinely asked in a sort of repertorial way. And that is about the point I was trying to raise at the beginning of my remarks about the difference between the sensational and the significant. That is how significant are these events actually in terms of the broad perspective of the Republic, and particularly of the Islamic role, integration in some sense. It's one of the things that we've learned in America, as I said before, is to mistrust the sensational as a guide always to what is significantly happening within a society. Is it not the case, or is it an illusion to think that while highly visible and violent events take place, that on the ground, so to speak, the work of assimilation, of integration, whatever word we choose to use, after all, in every society goes on not by a diktat from on top, it goes on by the daily work of people going to school and finding jobs, going to better schools, getting higher education, being elected to office, becoming professors. That's the way, in the instance I know best, the Russian Jews becoming Americans, that's the way that happened. It didn't happen through the resolution of a crisis. It happened through 1,000 or 1 million small sanities working out every day. Do we not have reason to hope that a similar process is actually going on in France now, beneath and despite the sensational acts?
Yes, I think you can have two readings of what's happening. First, the assassination of Charlie Hebdo were not the first symptoms. Ilan Halimi, a Jewish young guy, had been killed and tortured by a gang in which look like racist crime. And then Mohamed Merah in Toulouse has killed as many children as he could with his machine gun. And
and also some Muslims.
And also some, yeah, but yes, they were soldiers.
Muslim soldiers.
Yes. Muslim soldiers, because they were working with the French army. And so you had harbingers of what happened. And of course you can have two views of this. On one hand, as you said, Adam, the Muslims are being integrated in France. They're working, they're going to schools. The present Minister of Education, Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, was my student in Sciences Po, and she was a very brilliant student at that time. Also, I do not always agree with the reform she makes as a minister, but that's another issue. But you have now Muslims all at every stage and at every corner of the French society, engineers, doctors, lawyers, and as Muslims have been present in France for now almost 100 years. But on the other hand, the task and the goal of the radicals is to separate the Muslim community from the national community and to tell the Muslim, you have to re-Islamize yourself. You're bad Muslims. You've been corrupted by Western ideas. So now let's go back to the real Islam and let's support the Caliphate or Al-Qaeda or another group. And that's exactly what is at stake with this what happened. That is why we need in France, and more than ever, to make a new contract with the Muslims, as we did with the Jews 2 centuries ago, and we edict clear rules.
At the time of Napoleon, you mean?
Yeah, at the time of Napoleon. We have to edict clear rules and help the Muslims to funding the mosques and to build new schools for imams. And that is the only way to prevent the separation of the Muslim community from the rest of the national community. And this is the most urgent task that the government has to do, besides, of course, neutralizing the terrorists.
Well, two of the most moving assessments that I read after September or January the 7th, both were written by the Francophone writer Tahar Ben-Jelloun. One was an editorial published in the New York Times, and the second one, a similar editorial written in Libération. And I found that very reassuring and comforting. Also, I mentioned this meeting with the chief rabbi of France, and he meets regularly, once a week, with the chief hammam in France, to find ways to cooperate and work together and become part of a larger community. So I find that it's not going to solve everything. Part of the problem also is linked to a whole underclass inhabiting the Paris suburbs. And many of those people suffer from hopelessness.
I'm just a little, I guess I would want to say that the presumption here is that there is a national community whose identity is very clear.
No.
But that is the presumption, because everybody, I mean, people, I don't know, maybe I'm mistaken. So if that's not, it seems the question of assimilation or integration, you have to integrate to something. So the question is, what is it that is being integrated into, and on what terms?
But Judge St. Caroline, the thing you're being integrated into changes with your integration. I mean, that's the
it's not static.
That's the story of the great American immigrations and integrations, don't you agree?
Right, but the nature of assimilation obviously changes over time as well, and there are different kinds of forms of acculturation. And I was going to say in response to some of this that the idea that you are said if you want to be a real Muslim, you have to be a radical, is a form of what every minority in any culture has to deal with. You're not black enough, you're not Jewish enough, you're not, right? So I think that to see these things in structural terms is really important, instead of, I mean, and I would agree, of course, we need to work with, you know, imams and rabbis should talk to each other, you know, there's no question. But it's sort of, let's all get along is probably, though, at some levels, assimilation, however one wants to define it, is not working in France. That seems to me the point of departure. If it's not working, why is it not working? Is it not working because some Muslims are terrorists? Probably, to some extent, because of the way. Is it also not working because there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims and Jews? Yes. Do a lot of Muslims want to be identified as French? Yes. Did a lot of Muslims also complain because they had to be out there, they felt, as always happens with minorities, protesting against the killings in order to have credibility so that they wouldn't, their whole community would not feel under attack? Yes. This is happened to every minority, it happened to Jews, right? So I guess the discussion, it seems to me, should depart at least from the notion of what is the community now, how do we integrate into it, and as you said, it changes over time, of course, but what, you know, what are the particular problems that inhibit assimilation?
Well, maybe starting from the very notion of community, I always get shivers up my spine when the administration at Dartmouth talks about the Dartmouth community. And as I once...
That means someone's been offended.
Yes, when and when I suggested to the president that he should look at the etymological meaning of the word community and see just why it doesn't work. One last question I would like to ask Nicolas, and that is, I've been reading about what the Hollande government has suggested by increasing the city limits of Paris to bring the suburbs more into the city.
Paris.
Yeah, the Grand Paris. Do you think that might have some positive effect?
It might have some positive effect. Recently, they suppressed the difference of tariff between suburbs, and so there will be more circulation, maybe between the suburbs and the center of Paris, and the highway called périphérique won't be this wall anymore between the center of Paris. But I think the problem and the question is that is it possible, as Pascal seems to say, to impose today, like in the 19th century it was done with the Jew, a kind of religion compatible with nowadays democracy. I don't know what is really at stake in an expression like European Islam, and I am afraid that Muslim people doesn't want it. They don't want their religion to be reformed from outside. Even though it is true that there is a growing process of secularism within Muslim population.
Would it not be possible, Pascal, that if you were a Muslim and you thought about what Europeanized Catholicism and Europeanized Judaism had become, and how defanged and how limited in authority they had become through the process, would you embrace Europeanized Islam?
Definitely, definitely, yes. But, you know, when I was young, we didn't define ourselves through our religion. We were just names, not even family names. We didn't care from which origin we were. And for the last 20 years...
in school, do you mean? In school?
In school or at the university. We were just names and private persons. And we didn't care whether you were Jewish or Christian or atheist. And now those lines matter a lot. And I think it's extremely sad because we have replaced identity problems with class problems, for instance, or other analyses. But I think that the main issue now is the reform of Islam, precisely. And we underestimate greatly the number of French Muslims who want to be seen not as Muslims, but as French first, and secondly, Muslims. So it's a matter of what is your identity? Are you part of a nation which has no precise identity, but which is still moving forward? Or are you first and foremost a Muslim, which everything that it represents? And it's the same goes for the Catholic, for the Protestant, and for the Jews. And being French, and then secondarily Jewish or atheist or Muslim, is quite relieving, because you're part of a great adventure. And that's precisely what we should offer to all our citizens.
Thank you. I want to pass now to questions. I'd like Professor Susan Bryson, who's our local specialist on free speech. I know you had a question.
Oh, sorry, I thought these were already on.
That's okay. If you could get up and so.
I want to give, this was all wonderful, thank you, Larry, for organizing it. I want to give Adam the opportunity to respond to the argument that you were presenting as devil's advocate, and do a somewhat more nuanced version of it, which you alluded to in mentioning Gary Trudeau's comment about punching down. And it has to do with satire. And now that I know that you wrote a thesis on satire, I'm especially curious to know.
Can everyone hear?
No. Oh, I'm sorry. It's about satire. And now that I know that you wrote a thesis on satire, I'm really interested to know how Adam would respond to the argument made by some writers who protested the Penn Award. That's what I'm focusing on now, not the actual event, which was, if you look at the history, the tradition of satire, it is about punching up. It's only effective, funny satire if the satirist is attacking those in power. And the response was that some people who disproved of the Penn Award said, no, in that context, in France, Charlie Hebdo was punching down. They were attacking people who were in power. So I wanted to...
Sure. First of all, I wrote the thesis, but I never got the degree. So that may say something about this. I did. I published it. That's easy. But I never went back to do the to defend it. I never went back to defend it, and I went exactly. That's what I'm missing. This is the oral defense today. Get them to give me the degree. Three things quickly. One is I think that whether we like it or not, there's also a tradition of reactionary satire, which is rich and important. See it in someone in our country like Tom Wolfe, for instance. Tom Wolfe is a wonderful writer and a satirist, but he satirizes the world from the point of view of an extremely conservative point of view, who finds that all of the misadventures of New York Jews with, I don't mean that he's anti-Semitic at all, but that all the misadventures of New York Jewish intellectuals with abstract expressionist painting and Bauhaus building are ridiculous and ludicrous, and that the real wisdom of the country resides in its old-fashioned leadership class. Just making the point that not all satire, whether we want it to be or not, is punches up. The second point I'd make about that is, it seems to me on the merits, Charlie Hebdo, and I will add that I was not a regular addicted reader of Charlie Hebdo in the many years I lived in France, but always understood its role. If you look at it, it was, as Pascal said, as many of us said at the time, an equal opportunity offender, that it did not pick on the oppressed. In fact, in all the years that I read it, sporadically, its chief targets always seemed to be French politicians. It always seemed to be the president and the church and French politicians whose sexual equipment it regularly diminished, mocked, and made fun of. There were far more jokes about, in plain English, Sarkozy's dick than there ever were about Mohammed's. That is mocking up. That is surely punching up when you're taking as your primary target the church, when you're taking as your primary target the most powerful institutions and individuals in the country. And it seemed to me that that was far and away the most potent part of, and most visible part of what Charlie Hebdo did. So I think Gary, who's a smart man, was just misinformed about that. And then finally, I'd say that it seems to me that, again, I'm repeating myself, and I'm sorry for doing it, but I think it's an important distinction. An insult to an ideology, blasphemy directed at a religion, are very, very different things than threats made to people. That when we gave that award to Charlie Hebdo, we were saying that the threat was wrong and the act was evil and the survivors should be honored. It was not a stamp of endorsement on every single cartoon ever made. The counter-argument, I'm well aware of it because I had it with many people. The people on the other side of this argument were neither fools nor bien-pensants. They were smart people, and they said, well, would you give an award to Der Stürmer, you know, Julius Streicher's legendary anti-Semitic journal in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, which was filled with hideous anti-Semitic cartoons. If somebody had shot up their offices, would you give an award? And again, I repeated that just because cartoons are not in language, just because they're not propositional, they're not argumentative, they're not put out in sentences, doesn't mean that you cannot interpret them correctly or incorrectly. If you interpret the cartoons in Der Stürmer as anything except threats to the existence of Jewish people, you have not interpreted them correctly. If you interpret the cartoons in Charlie Hebdo as threats to the well-being or existence of Muslims, you have misinterpreted them. That's a real distinction I think you can make. And those were that's my response to that line of argument.
Professor Lucas Hollister?
Yes.
Speak up, please. Stand.
I have a quick question and a couple of short remarks.
Elaborate.
A question and a couple of short remarks. First, I wanted to ask, all of you spoke a little bit about the protests, and I know that when Alain Badiou commented on those protests, the main feature that he highlighted was that they were called by the state. And for him, that was a big difference between a spontaneous protest and a protest endorsed by and called by the state. Does that have any importance for you? That's my first question. Second, I wanted to mention just a few things about censorship and free speech. The discussion has been undertaken as if there's been sort of a clear, I mean, there is a clear delineation in French law, but in practice, this has been a fraught issue all throughout the 20th century. Obviously, La Bataille d'Alger was censored, NTM, you know, rap groups in the 90s, Virginie Despentes Baise-Moi was censored and then uncensored, radical feminist crime films. So censorship, the idea that censorship is something that is being imposed from without on a society that has clear rules and guidelines that are being followed consistently strikes me as perhaps problematic. The last thing that I wanted to thank Carolyn Dean in particular for bringing up was this notion of the idea of France. And one of the things that troubled me about the reaction to the Charlie Hebdo attacks was precisely the way in which Charlie Hebdo became part of French tradition, first of all, through an assimilation with satire, which was strange to me because for Houellebecq in the late 90s, Charlie Hebdo was American, he called it the hedonist libidinal option imported from the United States. So this was American culture brought to France. And before that, in the 70s, they were internationalists, right? They were Marxists. This is not French tradition, this is internationalism. This is an attack on Frenchness, on de Gaulle, right? The inaugural gesture of Charlie Hebdo was mocking de Gaulle's death and being censored for it, right? So those are some comments that I thought maybe could be brought up and treated by the panelists.
Well, I would make just one comment. There is a major difference between censorship and murder. You know, and this is also in France the main difference between Le Front National of Marine Le Pen, which I deeply dislike, and the jihadists. The main difference is that the Front National, however despicable are their ideas, do not kill their opponents. And this is a way to draw the line between classical censorship and prohibition to speak.
I just would say on the question of censorship and laws, any time you try and define in law the difference between acceptable speech and unacceptable speech, it's going to be problematic. It's never going to be a bright line mechanically applied in every imaginable case to universal agreement. If you're not, as we would say in America, First Amendment absolutist, if you believe that there are kinds of speech that should be discouraged or even penalized or even forbidden, Holocaust negationism being the classic case, if you believe that, then you have to believe that you can search for some kind of criterion that will enable you to distinguish between those things, and you accept in advance that it's going to be a mutable, difficult, controversial criterion. It's just built into the nature of making laws. It seems to me, as I said before, it's true about any law you would make about any subject. It's true about distinguishing between murder, manslaughter, and self-defense. It's built into it. Those things are controversial in their very nature. So the reality that they have been endlessly controversial in their application seems to me unsurprising. The second thing I'd say about the particularities is I think that you're quite right that Charlie Hebdo in its first appearance, which is delicious both because it begins by mocking de Gaulle and adopting a name taken from Charles Schulz's Peanuts from Charlie Brown, which is mind-blowing to us who associate Charlie Brown with everything that Charlie Hebdo was not. Nonetheless, I'd say again that is that exactly the point I'd want to make is that French identity, the French tradition, is extremely large. It covers a broad spectrum of history, a broad spectrum of traditions. And somebody who was drawing as a Marxist or an internationalist in the 1970s would be drawing on a French radical tradition, which goes back deep into the 19th century, which engages Philippon's assaults on Louis Philippe and engages Daumier and Daumier's caricatures as well. So I think that you can both be an anti-nationalist, not believing in some imaginary French identity which remains pristine and untouched over the centuries, and still say, you know what, these folks are working in a tradition that has a history in this place, in this city, and in this language. It seems to me those two things are possible, and it's wise to make that connection.
Nicolas?
Concerning your first remark, the problematic endorsement by the power and the problematic leaders of the world, for instance, Recep Tayyip Erdogan or others, I think you're right. There's a very important point to stress, even lately. It is worth considering that the attack would not have been so murderous if the security around the building of Charlie would have been, let us say, correctly made. I think it's an important point. I was upset during those days to observe how easily the responsibility of the police have been put under the carpet and the Ministre de l'Intérieur. That is especially upsetting if we take into consideration the way the power in place has exploited the situation in order to overturn its marked unpopularity. But after the attack, it was almost impossible to raise any critical remark against the police and to put the blame on the security force without being suspected of being obsessed by a conspiracy theory. It is strange enough to have seen in France, in the street of Paris, where the revolutionary tradition is so widespread, was so widespread, a crowd cheering the CRS and the army. That's quite a turning point.
Let me ask you, Nicolas, I think that's an extremely good point, and it's one that we can all remember from the post-9/11 time. One of the things you're not allowed to ask is, how could anything like this, where the terrorists pretty much wore nameplates, how could it have happened? Why do you conjecture as a journalist the security was so poor?
Because it's difficult to answer such a question, because it had been a long time that Charlie was under control without any threat and maybe a negligence, comme on dit. It was a kind of negligence. That's my hypothesis.
A lot about these security shortcomings. So you can't say that nobody tackled this problem. Your newspaper told me.
Yeah. But it was rather isolated position.
Question that addresses one of the issues that Carolyn Dean raised, that is, what is French identity? So what does it mean to be French? And this is a question that was raised by the media coverage of the Charlie Hebdo attacks. So I think one thing we all noticed was that on social media there was this resounding identification with Charlie Hebdo, which was to be Charlie. So what does it mean that people were so quick to identify with the publication? Because I think it's one thing to say, to defend the right to publish, the right to critique religion and ideology, and another to say, to align oneself. So, in such public public way with it on social media and also in demonstrations, in protests, I mean, you know, on the streets. So why is it that on this issue there was such an outpouring, I think, such a public display of, you know, aligning oneself with it? Je suis Charlie. That statement resonated throughout.
I'll just say one thing, because I need to say this before I answer the question in the spirit that it was asked. And the spirit I discussed the question or tried to raise it, which is that one of the first things that happened, I'm DGS of my department, which means Director of Graduate Studies of my department, and I walked in January when school started, and the person who assists me, because it's a really large department, so I have to have somebody helping me, and she had a giant Je suis Charlie on her door, and I realized that she was very active in the union, and I realized that she was using this as an expression of solidarity with the vulnerable. That's what she just assumed with the murdered, with vulnerable people. It had become appropriated in this completely, you know, and I sort of thought that was kind of nice in its own way, but also I was kind of, you know, had this, wait a minute, this is no, right? And the reason I thought no isn't because one wasn't moved by the crowd, though, as Nicolas mentioned, it's a complicated question. One wasn't moved by the crowd, but that there was a clear identification, and the identification was with Charlie and not with what, you know, as we've said, you know, yes, you said there were signs for some of the Jewish victims, etc., but by far the identification was with Charlie, and though people creatively created other people to identify with randomly, this was, and that is the question, is why this identification? I mean, and that is the question, I think, and that is the question that has not really been asked because it's presumed as the starting point. That's all. I mean, I'm repeating myself too.
It can be, sorry.
Because you identify yourself with the victims.
That's right.
The murder was so brutal.
But there were many victims.
And, yes, but some of them were as Adam pointed out, very popular. Cabu, Wolinski were very well-known people.
And it's not a totalization.
No, it's a way to show your solidarity.
If I said after September 11th, I'm a New Yorker, it doesn't mean that I have a singular identity.
No, yes.
I'm just responding to the attack.
Sure, I wasn't saying that's why I raised the question of the staff person who obviously found, you know, that her identification was with the victims, and that's what she meant by putting that on her door. But I guess there's something else, which is you can't ignore the context in which this identification.
What is the context?
The context is, okay, murder, so you can't be for murder, right? And you can't be for the murder of, you can't be for the murder of Jews, you can't be for the murder of cartoonists, nobody's for murder. But all I'm saying is that the identification is not simply an identification that is shorn of any context in which you see a victim and you think, Je suis Charlie, why are victims not I mean, obviously they were known, people cared about them, but why did they not say, I can't remember the name of the guy that they mentioned most often, who was murdered.
The policeman.
In the Hypercacher.
Oh, in the Hypercacher.
Nobody mentioned the policeman murder, nobody, I mean, which might have been. Well, okay,
newspaper made
maybe, well, okay, the way it was reported here, I'm not, you know, I'm making a point. I'm not trying to say people who identified with Charlie were bad. I'm not saying that. It's obviously a very moving spectacle. It's a moving moment. It can be appropriated in all kinds of ways. I'm just saying it isn't just that. And I think that we should be asking what else it is.
You don't think, Carolyn, that gestures of solidarity of that kind tend to have a minimal ideological content? You know, when there was the Boston Marathon bombing, and you said, I'm, you know, Boston strong. I hate the Boston Bruins, and I hate the Boston Red Sox. I'm a New Yorker. But that doesn't, but that doesn't mean, but one can understand that wasn't, you weren't, when you were saying that, it had minimal ideological content. It was just a gesture of solidarity that was the first one it had. It was a performative utterance more than it was an ideological position.
You could also argue it was an overdetermined identification, though, as well. So that, I mean, both are, I think, correct. That's.
I'd say, what does it mean to say, Je suis Charlie, I am Charlie, because that seems to go beyond solidarity. It seems, because one can have sympathy or condemn attacks without saying that we are Charlie. Because I don't think that most people are Charlie. Most of us wouldn't publish.
It can also mean I have been wounded as well.
But
Yeah, freedom of speech, yeah.
Professor Françoise Meltzer.
and it didn't last a long time.
No, no, it's over. We're not Charlie anymore. Be reassured. We're French, looking after their own identity. Who are we wonder.
I just want to add.
A little louder.
Can you hear me? I just want to add to this conversation, to go back to what Carolyn Dean said concerning multi-ethnicity and what it means to be French and what is France. Because I think that one thing we haven't perhaps talked about enough is the fact that one of the reasons the right in France is becoming increasingly powerful is because of phobia against any other, and in particular the Muslims. And that has to do with a sort of, how should I put this, many French notions that France doesn't exist anymore or is being destroyed by all these immigrants. And that, that's what Marine Le Pen is feeding off of. And so part of the protest, there were lots of different parts of the protest. It wasn't monolithic. And part of the protest, and part of saying Je suis Charlie is, Charlie is white, and he's male, and he's a real French person, and I am French, and I am France, and that's what not a lot, but some of the protesters were responding to. So in the mix of all this, we have to remember the threat that many French people feel of their culture being irrevocably changed in a way they don't recognize. And that fear is very strong, and as I said before, affects the power of Marine Le Pen. She's, really making a lot of progress is the wrong word, but she's making the most of that. And so clearly at the center of this is what is happening to France? What can I call France? What does it mean to be French? And there are many different answers to that, but one of them is from the right. And what the right is saying is French is a Catholic, Jewish, and the same problems with the Jews in the 19th century. It's a repetition compulsion. It's a total repetition compulsion, but the deal now is, okay, enough already, we're losing our very identity. So that in that sense, Je suis Charlie means I want to be like that, not dead, but that guy. So anyway.
I think that's true for a certain sector of the population, without doubt, but these, what one calls les guerres franco-françaises, is something which goes back, you can go back, the whole mistake is found in the French Revolution, Napoleon giving Jews citizenship, they're perverting real France, whatever that is. Yes, absolutely, Professor Will.
I thought that might play into something, Carolyn, you were saying about l'indignité, and which is so I was just pre-associating because Carolyn had made a point about l'indignité, which was a concept that was brought up against collaborators after the Vichy regime. And it struck me that there's a historical dimension to this issue, which has of what it means to be French. And if you think about how the collaborators were given this denial of French identity on the basis of identifying with an occupying force, I'm wondering about how Muslims in France are identified with a kind of occupying, troubling occupation of an essential Frenchness that has just simply gone too far now. And I'm not sure how much l'indignité is really in the air as a possible legal kind of punishment. That's the first I had ever heard of it when you brought that up. But it does strike me that there's a historical context here for bringing that into the discussion.
Yeah, I brought that up, and also the quotation from Marine Le Pen. I always call her Marine Le Pen because I think it tells you a lot if you hear Marine Le Pen saying the Jews and the gays are with us. I mean, it's a little, and there's some neighborhoods.
That's a huge progress.
Yes.
And some of that is true.
It's huge progress.
It's a huge progress from the extreme right.
Well, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it also is a tactic. But what it does leave you with is who is targeted here, right? And secondly, the indignité, it's again very clear, yes, it was raised. I think just the fact that it became an issue tells you that there's a problem, and that what the ultimate penalty was to take, because they can't go against the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, which insists that no one can be made stateless, which is obviously, so the French government can't be in the business of making anyone stateless. So that's why they focused on people who are binational. So since most of, obviously the North African population, many of them, some of them born in France, obviously it's still called immigrés, even though they're born in France, in fact, mostly. And that itself needs to be addressed, I think, and people aren't discussing that. But also the fact that, so they would be most likely to have dual passports or dual nationality. So you're saying you're not French, you're really Algerian, even though you've never been in Algeria, right? Or whatever. And so I just think that all I'm trying to do, is raise this as an issue, in the way Françoise Mercier did, and just to say, as you're saying, is we should be discussing this as well. I think it's really an important dimension of this, in the same way as anti-Semitism is. But the co-optation by Marine Le Pen, the attempted co-optation, seems to me to say a lot about what's going on in France, as you had mentioned, right?
3 last questions. One.
I'm feeling very uncomfortable that we're not hearing from a Muslim. There may be some in the audience, I don't know. But I was wondering why we don't have a Muslim.
Why we don't have a Muslim is that several of the Muslims that I had invited, there's very secular Muslims, they don't speak English. That's why.
Well, you could have you've got these people all the way from France. You could have found somebody somewhere in this country.
Well, somebody who's studied this.
What's that?
Darren?
I just want to remind people of the headline of Le Monde on the 12th of September, "We are all Americans," and God forbid.
Which was renounced exactly 24 hours later by a huge swath of French people.
Of course.
Sorry, I just had to.
No, it's absolutely true. It wasn't as long-lasting as Je suis Charlie, but I think there was an identification of immediate sympathy, as Adam points out, but then also an identification of values, precisely of some of these shared Enlightenment values that were called into question by the events.
Last question. Yes.
Adam Gopnik has forcefully distinguished between free speech and hate speech. Free speech, principle of free speech mandates that we allow insults to ideology, mockery, including insults to Judaism itself, mockery of Judaism. And on the other hand, we have hate speech, which is objectionable, prosecutable in France, because it advocates attacks on individuals, groups of people. By what principle does denial of the Holocaust have to count as hate speech rather than permissible insults to ideology?
It's a good question, and let me try and unpack it as best I can. I think Nicolas could probably do a better job than I could of explaining it in the French context. And that is because, as we learned on Friday when the Supreme Court, or Thursday when the Supreme Court spoke, words only have meaning within context. Words are actions of a kind that can't be isolated and treated in isolation. We understand that when someone denies the Holocaust, says the Jews were not killed in camps or in ravines in Poland and Ukraine, what that means as an effective statement is that their claim to victimhood, their claim to a special understanding of their history, that many things follow from that. In other words, it's perfectly possible, I don't mean to trivialize your question at all, because it would be perfectly possible to have, and indeed we have had, honest and direct historical investigation that altered the numbers of those killed, or altered the locations of those killed, or altered the motives, revised in that sense, the motives of those. But I think it would be the height of naivete. Or give you a better example of the Confederate flag. It has exactly the same kind of weight as the Confederate flag. We can certainly multiply instances in which the Confederate flag has been flown or used or employed by football teams and motorcycle groups in a non-racist context. It wouldn't be hard to do. So why are we banning or eliminating the Confederate flag? Because we know from our cumulative experience that in actual fact, when the Confederate flag appears, it is almost invariably a flag of white supremacism. That's been its history, that's what it stood for, that's been how it's understood. That's why that particular peculiar arrangement of stars and diagonal lines we're in the process now on a startlingly bipartisan basis of eliminating it, because we know that's what its actual meaning is. Similarly, it seems to me that we know that Holocaust denial, negationism, like the Confederate flag, which is inseparable from white supremacism, Holocaust denial is inseparable from anti-Semitism and some form of neo-Nazism. That would be my explanation of it.
Any other
I'm not competent to answer this question, but as Caroline asked us to remember the context, I think we have to replace what happened with Charlie Hebdo and the Hypercacher and what happened in France 4 days ago when a guy has been beheaded and a gas plant has been attacked in order to blow it away. We are at war. We should not forget it. We are at war. Tens of thousands of jihadists want to redraw the map of the planet, and France, like the United States, is just a little province of this war. And so that's exactly the challenge we are facing. At the same time, maintaining our principle and democratic institution, and on the other hand, defending ourselves and especially protecting the Muslim fellow citizens who are the first target of those attacks. Just remember that nowadays in France, synagogues, Jewish schools, mosques, churches, commercial centers are being protected by the soldiers. And this says a lot. Of course, we can have highly elevated debates about freedom of speech, but the first task of the government is to save the bodies, and in which concerns France to prevent the Jewish community from leaving France and going abroad. So I think this is, we should always remember this context, which is, of course, crucial.
Well, if I may, and as you know, I share many beliefs, thoughts, and long conversations with Pascal, but there I have to disagree with you, Pascal. I think that the rhetoric of war, that we are at war, that we are in the middle of a war, is one that Americans particularly have learned tragic lessons about. That to see the threat of terrorism, no matter how vile, no matter how horrific, in the context of war, with all of the military rhetoric that flows from it, is dangerous. It overrates the threat, it seems to me, which, however horrible, remains marginalized for the most part, in France, as I think it does in America, and it overstimulates our reaction. It leads us, as it led so many of us in this country, to disastrously self-destructive actions, which in the thought of pursuing this war of values, this war to protect the values of the open society, leads us ultimately to betray those values and leads us through the overreaction to behave badly. So I agree with you about almost everything, Pascal, but I don't agree with the metaphor of war.
Yes, just to answer to you, we do not decide that we are at war. Our enemies say we are at war with you and we will destroy you. That's the main difference. It's unwillingly that we have to consider that there is a war which is being waged against France. And even if we disagree with crazy projects of foreign expeditions, we still have to recognize that nowadays France is on the foot of war, whether we like it or not. But I reassure you, we'll not invade Iraq. I swear.
I think this is Switzerland. Moment yes. To end. I'd like to thank our panel. You're invited.